this program, Kevin Atkins will be in the lounge where you can record a few of your memories for posterity. Mentioning Kevin brings to mind the many, many things he's done to help with this celebration, including, as you heard, he's recording this program, Zooming this program, he's digitized the thousands of photos, and they're including the ones that are in your program, including the ones that are in the slideshow, and most importantly, Kevin's kind presence was with Harriet on the last day of her life. Thank you very much, Kevin. So in the next hour, you'll be hearing lots of stories about Harriet, but undoubtedly you'll say to yourself, why didn't they tell the story about the time when she... Or, that's not the way it really happened. So, please plan to share a few of your stories or your version of the story after this program with Kevin. But meanwhile, please, for the next few minutes, enjoy Memories of the Alhambra. Just in case you were asleep. William Wordsworth begins his Intimations Ode with these lines. There was a time when meadow, grove, and stream, the earth and every common sight, to me did sing of herald and celestial light, the glory and the freshness of a dream. It is not now as it hath been of yore. Turn wheresoe'er I may, by night or day, the things which I have seen, I now can see no more. The rainbow comes and goes, and lovely is the rose. The moon doth with delight look round her when the heavens are bare. Waters on a starry night are beautiful and fair. The sunshine is a glorious bird. And yet I know, where'er I go, that there hath passed away a glory from the earth. Yes, Harriet was a glory in and of herself, and she was a glorious part of our lives. John Steinbeck wrote, "A man's life can be measured by the quality and number of his glories, and so can a woman's. And by that standard, few lives can compare with that of our vivacious friend who loved this world and almost everything that was in it." We're reminded of a few moments in that life by the photographs and the lovely program for which we can thank Cumston in Urbana. And our speakers will remind us of a few more of those glorious moments. And so we begin with thoughts from Julie Takla, who is very much like Harriet. She's a teacher, scholar, author of literally dozens of presentations and publications, Emerita Professor of Learning Technologies at the University of Missouri, and world traveler. But most importantly for us today, she is Harriet's beloved daughter, Julie Takla.
I'm going to talk a little bit about pre-Terre Haute Harriet. Harriet moved to Terre Haute in the summer of 1967 when she was 39 years old. Very few people here knew her before she burst onto the Terre Haute scene, but my brother Jimmy, her son, cousins Vicki and Jenny, and Harriet's cousin, John Allison, maybe we knew her best as a young mother-in-law during the time before she came to Terre Haute. So I'd like to take a few minutes, no more than 45, to give you a brief introduction to pre-Terre Haute Harriet, so that we can celebrate the fullness of her life. Harriet was born and lived in Highland Park, Illinois, most of her life until the early 1960s. By all accounts, she had an idyllic and loved childhood with her parents, Morley and Julia McNeil, and her younger sister, Mary. Morley was a pediatrician, and Julia was an accomplished pianist. Harriet followed in her mother's footsteps, majoring in music, specifically piano, at the University of Colorado. She went there to study under a close friend and colleague of her mother, Mark Wessel, until her marriage to a fellow University of Colorado student and graduate, Claire Freeman. Harriet and Claire divorced in the early 1950s, leaving Harriet a single mother of 2 children, Jimmy and Lee, and an interrupted college education. During the early to mid-50s, Harriet was a wife and a divorcee, mother and part-time employee at 2 retail businesses in Highland Park, the Chestnut Court Bookshop and the Red Shutters, an antique decorating store owned by a longtime family friend, Uncle Bob Robinson. It was during this time that Harriet's love of the history of art, particularly Renaissance art, emerged. She shared that love with her father, Morley, and she traveled to Italy frequently during the 50s, often in the company of her parents and Uncle Bob, and sometimes alone. Jimmy, Vicki, Jenny, and I remember that as young children, Harriet's bedroom at her parents' house was redecorated and christened the Italian Room, as it was filled with mementos from her travels to Italy. Another love she shared with her parents, particularly her mother Julia, was the love of music. She and her mother would listen to and discuss music, play piano duets, and attend concerts in Chicago together. As you know, both of these loves, the love of Italian art in Italy and the love of music, particularly opera, was a significant part of the Harriet you all knew. There was a brief interruption to this life when she married Hartley Ray, a unitary minister, and moved from GMU to Orange, New Jersey, to begin her new incarnation as a minister's wife. So you can picture that. Harriet and Hartley's marriage was brief, and she returned to Highland Park to her parents' home. Shortly thereafter, she married Ken Campbell, tourists that she had met on one of her trips to Italy. Harriet had moved to Englewood, New Jersey in the early 1960s with her two children, Mary, and two of Ted's children, Peter and Ann. It was during this time in Englewood that she was also a loving, part-time stepmother to Ted's two additional children, Deborah, who you'll see in the program, and Julie, another one, and a new mother to Florence, her fiance, as you all know her, because that's what Harriet called her. From the vantage point of a child, this marriage seemed to be one of excitement and adventure for her. In fact, it is during this marriage that she may have been able to begin to tap into and explore additional aspects of herself. They traveled, they went skiing, rode horses, sailed, had big parties, listened to and played music, and surrounded themselves with interesting people. She also began graduate studies in art history at Columbia University during this time. And Harriet that arrived in Terre Haute in 1967 was in the process of finalizing a painful divorce. Most of her life at this point had been as a wife, mother, daughter, sister, and of course friend to many people, primarily in the town where she was born, and spent the majority of her childhood and young adult life. During her first few years in Terre Haute, she was working on and finishing a dissertation that required frequent travel to Italy for research. She was teaching for the first time, learning to navigate the faculty culture, which I'm sure many of you in here can understand or Italian. Raising a small child, dealing with two pretty incorrigible late adolescent children, and becoming part of the Terre Haute community. Terre Haute Harriet arrived here as herself, certainly, the free spirit and uncaged bird that you all knew. But she also arrived as a woman who having grown up in a pretty sheltered world, continually pushed through life to embrace with wonder and gusto new experiences and trends.
Thank you very much, Julie. Are you all able to hear? We've been having some problems with the microphone, and Anthony, our sound technician, is trying hard to make sure that you can hear. And we'll try to adjust the microphone so that it works a little bit better. Among Harriet's loves, as Julie mentioned, was the piano. In fact, many of you will remember that she had a concert grand piano in her living room, in her house on 7th Street. So in honor of her love for the piano, please enjoy Domenico Scarlatti's keyboard sonata in D minor. sweetheart of Sigma Chi. So, Harriet was sweet, but she was also feisty. Julie, do you remember a dark evening on a deserted street in Florence, Italy, when Harriet was walking home and a man came running up behind her and stole her handbag? Now, Harriet was rarely angry, and she was so generous that if the thief had asked, she might have given him whatever he needed. But he stole her handbag, and she was incensed. She took off after that thief with such vigor and vehemence, she must have terrified him. He dropped her handbag and raced off. Now, Harriet was not injured, but she was insulted. "Well," she said in a huff, "can you believe that? I never." Now, she had never suffered such a fate, the same fate that many tourists had, even though she had lived there for many decades. Finally, she had received the ultimate initiation. But, unlike most victims, she had prevailed. No surprise. And perhaps you're wondering, how old was she at that time? She was in her mid-70s. The poet Marianne Moore wrote, "Whatever the deed, let it be done with enthusiasm." Harriet did everything, including going after that thief, with enthusiasm, which is probably one of the reasons why she was a great teacher. Her teaching brings us to our next speaker, Lauren Ewing. Lauren lives in New York and is a sculptor and installation artist who has exhibited her work literally all around the world. However, from our point of view, her most important work is a sculpture that is in Gilbert Park, just off Wabash Avenue, Composite House for Terre Haute. Harriet often talked about Lauren's visit to Terre Haute when they spent many happy hours together riding around the Gilbert Park neighborhood, researching and photographing houses, and talking about ideas. Lauren Ewing. Speaking of photographs.
Thank you, Kara. You're welcome. I'm so pleased to be here today with you, Harriet's family, friends, and colleagues. It was my great good fortune to meet Harriet 55 years ago. It was the inglorious year of 1969. The Vietnam War was raging, and my generation was racked with sorrow and loss. I came to Terre Haute knowing no one to enter the master's program in art. I went to the humanities department to sign up for my electives, having been an undergraduate major in art history. The seminars in Renaissance architecture and women's art looked great to me. Harriet was the first person whom I met there, and she welcomed me as she welcomed all of her students with warmth and enthusiasm. Before I knew it, I was working in the humanities department. With Harriet's constant guidance, rearranging the Renaissance architecture slide catalog, which was also rich in paintings and sculpture. This was opportune for me because although I had been admitted to the master's program with a portfolio of paintings, I wanted to be a sculptor. I wanted to make things that are meaningful and a speaking part of the public environment. I was raised on a working farm in southern Indiana, and I had watched people with multiple skills make the world that they lived in. As a woman in the 1960s, I had little opportunity to make sculpture, except for one class in the ancient art of lost wax bronze casting. The arts program at ISU had a fine sculpture facility, and I was hard at work immediately. Harriet was doing research on a famous bell in Florence, and she wanted to know how bells are made. Soon she was over in a repurposed garage east of the campus, watching us invest, burn out, and pour molten bronze as artisans had done in the Renaissance and had been doing for 5,000 years plus. From here on, Harriet and I had a continuous and searching dialogue about who makes the world, who makes material culture, how and why, and what are we saying. After completing the master's program in visual arts, I enrolled in the humanities department and studied with Walter Hipple and William Ashbrook, things like aesthetics, the history of music, romanticism. I was very enriched. I left ISU in 1971 for an MFA program in sculpture at the University of California at Santa Barbara. From there, I had spent the last 50 years teaching and making sculpture that speaks about the world that we live in and hopefully becomes a part of social memory, the shared experiences that delight and unite us. There is so much to say about my 55-year friendship with Harriet that has shaped my life, that I have tried to express it in a spontaneous memory poem. I remember her love of her children, her love of art, her love of teaching, her love of mentorship, her love of discourse, her love of conversation, her love of the Renaissance, her love of architecture, her love of research, her love of Italy, her love of writing, her love of music, her love of her home, her love of parties, her love of vino, her love of laughter, her love of friends and colleagues, her love of community, her love of welcoming, her love of embracing, her love of life, her love of love. I'm going to, and in the spirit of always discovering fabulous women artists, I will close with the final 5 lines of a poem by Alice Rahone from the first translation and first publication of her poetry. I quote, "As we go out the gate, as the sun sets clear, will you tell us one more time how hard it is to be human when it is so easy to be divine?"
The Many Loves of Harriet McNeill. The divine Harriet was an outstanding teacher, not only because she inspired artists like Lauren, but also because she inspired students who chose very different career paths. For example, our next speaker, Eric Apfelstadt, who chose to join Harriet in the academic world, beginning with a PhD in art and archaeology from Princeton and continuing with appointments at some of the best universities in the nation, including Loyola University in Chicago, where he was dean and director of the Rome Center. Eric includes among his areas of interest Italian Renaissance art, Italian Renaissance architecture, Italian Renaissance sculpture, Italian Renaissance history. Sound like anyone you know? Eric Apfelstadt. Thank you, Eric.
Thanks so much, Sharon. I'm told that my first word was light. If so, that portended the attraction I immediately felt to Harriet's radiance when I encountered her as a student at Indiana State University. Seldom have I met anyone in the years since who more closely filled the words Chaucer applied to the part in the Canterbury Tales, and gladly would she teach and gladly learn. Harriet received, as you heard earlier from Julie, her PhD in art history from Columbia University. In the spring that I met her, with a dissertation titled Michelozzo, His Life, Sculptures, and Workshops. That brilliant study of one of the most outstanding artists of the Italian Renaissance is still a must-read for art historians to this day. Happily, she brought the energy, the insight, the enthusiasm, the appreciation of collaboration with which she wrote that piece to the teaching that she did. The humanities department, which Harriet taught and I majored, and where I met Lauren in 1969, valued and was devoted to rigorous scholarship, inspirational teaching, and interdisciplinary study. It was a perfect match for Harriet's broad interest, boundless curiosity, and passionate commitment to lifelong learning. She asked a lot of her students, even more of herself. Apart from, and many of this room know, the many classes prepared, the papers marked in the middle of the night, the special events arranged, advising offered. One of the greatest labors of love is probably processing that multitude of slides that Harriet amassed on her many travels and getting them into the university's collection. The journalist Thomas Friedman once commented that he, over the years, had lost track of the specific facts that many of his undergraduate classes had imparted, but he never forgot the thrill of learning with the best of his professors. And so it was with Harriet. And so it was for her thousands of students. She didn't just foster our development inside the classrooms. There were also those famous parties and that stake at home on South 7th, veritable academies, usually platonic, sometimes Dionysiac, but mind-blowing experiences for students and townspeople alike. When one of the many recommendations Harriet wrote succeeded in helping me win a graduate fellowship to study in Germany, Harriet quickly declared, "No serious student of mine is going to make his first port of call anywhere else than Florence." And so a few months later, dutifully after landing in Frankfurt, I caught an overnight train to Florence, where I found that Harriet arranged for a room in the same convent where she and Firenze were staying. And when I'd like to meet that great German expert in Leonardo da Vinci, who was staying there too. And could I please take her Fiat 850 and drive him to the hilltop fortifications he was studying tomorrow? For a young man who'd never been out of southern Indiana, and I grew up not far from Lauren in Evansville, that was pretty heady stuff. At the end of each day, Harriet would query me what I'd seen, what I'd learned. And as I went off to bed, I would read Walter Pacer's classic Studies in the Renaissance. His concluding remarks seemed to me so aptly to describe Harriet. Not the fruit of experience, but experience itself is the end. To burn always with that hard, gem-like flame. To maintain that ecstasy, that is life. Over the course of my career, I've looked for that special spark, that excitement and engagement, communication and connection, respect for others and oneself. Harriet had it in spades. She was all that and more. So many of us in this room are the better for having known her, learned from her, loved her, been loved by her. That outing with Professor Heidenreich and Harriet and up the mountains, and there he was in his blue suit, and there we were with Harriet with her wild mop of curly hair and the camera, that SLR slightly always swung around her neck. And as we came down, we found that he'd arranged for an impromptu lunch with a local family who had a closed restaurant that day. And during lunch, the little daughter was placed on a chair, and she would recite Dante. Harriet beamed, and she took pictures. And it was wonderful. And each one of many of you know in this room, each one of the canticles in Dante's Divine Comedy ends with images of the stars. Now, when Harriet's valiant little Fiat finally came to the end of its earthly days and had one last journey to make, we called and arranged for it to be towed, to be decommissioned in Florence. But I persuaded the driver to allow Harriet to sit behind the wheel of the car as it was towed through Florence. Which she did, radiantly, of course. And as fate would have it, that center where we were going was located on the Viale del Paradiso. Dante writes in the Paradiso that will and desire are one. with the cosmos. Impelled by the love that moves the sun and the other stars, Harriet was a star moved by love all her life. I'd like to think she's frolicking among the stars today.
Only two of Harriet's students will be speaking today. But the fact is that the word student comes from the Latin, which means to strive after. And didn't Harriet encourage all of us to strive after as she was striving? And the beauty of that is that she continued that striving to the very end. Yes, indeed. As Eric said, Harriet was a star, and she maintained ecstasy to the very end of her life. No one will appreciate this next story more than you do, Eric. I hope you haven't heard it, because it answers a question that faces every scholar. How do you know if your scholarship is truly respected by your peers? You know, they might say nice things. Truly respected by your peers. For our radiant friend, the positive answer to that question was, of course, unique. At 60, Harriet Kaplow decided that she would take back her family name, McNeil. Now, for decades, she was known as Harriet Kaplow. When her PhD was confirmed, listed on her diploma was Harriet Kaplow. Her publications and presentations listed her name as Kaplow. Then, after 30 years, she became Harriet McNeil. Several years after she changed her name, Harriet McNeil registered for a conference of international scholars of the Renaissance held in Florence, Italy. Unfortunately, her flight was delayed, so she arrived late. In fact, in the middle of the first plenary session, where people were talking about this brilliant scholar, Harriet Kaplow. What had happened to her? She hadn't published any articles, she hadn't given any presentations for several years. Where was she? Did anyone know? Was she still alive? And so, Harriet McNeil sat there, listening to people talk behind her back about what an outstanding scholar she was. I asked her what she did. She said nothing. She's just sat there. Now come on, folks. Now, is that the emblem of modesty? Wouldn't you have stood up and said, hey, here I am? Our friend Harriet, for all of her splendor, was also a very modest soul. But her scholarship, her academic exquisiteness, was only a part of her life. Eric referred to the party she hosted in her stately home on South 7th Street. Yes, indeed. Harriet enjoyed nothing more than a good party. Of all the parties that any of us attended, surely the best one took place almost 6 years ago at the Swope Art Museum on Harriet's 90th birthday. Nearly 200 people participated, one of whom was Harriet's good friend and colleague, and all-around bon vivant, as well as, on more than one occasion, her drinking companion, Jane England. Professor Emeritus of English at Indiana State University, for her 90th birthday, he borrowed, and may I say, improved upon a poem by William Shakespeare. Professor England.
I don't have to admit that I have brazenly gotten my structure from the Bard of Avon. I wrote this poem to give Harriet for her 90th birthday, and Florence was generous enough to ask me to repeat it. Who is Harriet? What is she that all her friends commend her? Culture, kind, and wise is she. And life such grace has lent her that she much admired thee. Of humanity she taught, with gifts indeed inspiring. For those who once knew naught soon found they were acquiring passion for what she had wrought. So to Harriet, let us sing. Though in Terre Haute dwelling, she is very Florentine, with depths of art excelling. To her, let us laurels bring.
Isn't this fun? Okay, thank you, Jean. The word passion in Jean's poem certainly describes Harriet's love for almost everything in this world, but she loved nothing more passionately than opera. I didn't even have to say the word. Her first trip to an opera occurred when she was, as she said, about 10 or 11. Now, you've seen the photographs of her as a child in your program. I want you to imagine that 10 or 11-year-old child, this is in the 40s, all dressed up, wearing white gloves. She went from her home in Hyde Park with a classmate, just the two of them, from Hyde Park to downtown Chicago to see her first opera. And that began a lifelong love affair. So, in planning today's celebration, we wanted to include something from an opera, and preferably an aria sung by a woman. But what? Have you seen the t-shirt that reads on the front, Opera Spoiler Alert? On the back, it reads, what happens at the end of La Boheme? She dies. What happens at the end of Madame Butterfly? She dies. What happens at the end of Tosca? She dies. La Traviata? She dies. And so on. But we wanted to include something a little less tragic. So please enjoy a delightful aria from La Boheme, Musetta's Waltz. Santa sings that song at a glamorous party, but it couldn't compare with Harriet's 90th, when people came to Terre Haute from all over the nation and even the world. You often hear people say negative and cynical things about Terre Haute, but never did you hear any such criticism from Harriet. She loved this city. Did she ever ask you this question? Do you know what the population of Florence was during the Renaissance? Well, probably not, unless you're Eric, of course. So you would say, no. And she would say, about 60,000. The same as the population of Terre Haute. So why can't Terre Haute have a renaissance and become a cultural center? She truly believed that, and she did everything she could to make it so. And so have our next three speakers. We begin with Mary Jo Moraldo, who is an artist whose installations and exhibitions have inspired hundreds of her fellow Haitians as well as admirers around the nation. She's a certified teacher of Ikenobo, the oldest form of Japanese flower arranging, and is a student of other Japanese arts, including calligraphy. Harriet loved Japan and was particularly enchanted when she visited Tojibi, Terre Haute's sister city. And she was a dedicated supporter of Mary Jo's work from the time she and her husband John returned to Terre Haute. Mary Jo Moraldo.
Thank you, Sherry. I want to say that I was not always an artist. I started out as an emergency room nurse. In my early 20s, while I was working a year at a hospital in Terre Haute, my family was planning a trip to Italy, beginning in Rome, onto Florence, Venice, and Assisi. So, in preparation for that trip, I decided I needed to take an art history class. So, I soon found one at ISU that I could audit. A few months later, I'm standing in front of Bernini's bronze gilded doors in Florence, in awe, and in awe in so many other places and treasures in Italy. Then later, at the Chicago Art Institute, where Brancusi's Golden Bird lifted memories of the ideas and insights and words of that young art history professor who had opened a path through a world that was totally new to me. She had shown me how to spend time with works of art, seeing their form and shape in detail, hearing the wordless, voiceless stories about them. I may have forgotten her name, but I knew this teacher had opened a world totally new. Fast forward some nearly 50 years later, and many museums later, I'm back in Terre Haute in the Halcyon Gallery when this sparkling white-haired lady walks up to me and John and asks us who we are. She greeted people with joy. She greeted the world. She greeted the trees. She greeted that river with joy. She never stopped showing us how to see works of art. But she also showed us how to see, take in, and breathe in
all the joy people hold. All of us here now hold her softly in our hearts with such absolute wonderful gratitude for Harriet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary Jo. Among Harriet's gifts was her ability to turn friends into family. Didn't we all, everyone in this room, feel as if we were, in fact, a part of her family? There's no better example of that than David Buchanan, who returned to Terre Haute as the director of the Vigo County Preservation Alliance, and several years later joined the staff at the Indiana State Museum as a curator. Throughout, they shared a love of history and historic preservation, but most of all, they shared a lifelong love of adventure. There was no one Harriet was closer to. He was the man Harriet, when she talked about him, referred to simply as Dave. He didn't need a last name. David Buchanan.
Sherry, in no uncertain terms, told me my 3-hour presentation had begun. So I'm going to try to do it in 10 minutes. I first met Harriet in her role as a professor at Indiana State University, and amazingly, we became good friends. I have no idea how that happened. I have no idea, but it was incredible, and what an experience and how it changed my life. We ended up really good friends and often would take road trips together. We simply referred to them as our road trips. The first one, where I went to Italy, my very first time, I was working on the ruin of my house in Indianapolis. You saw it at first, that's what you think, a ruin. And she called me up. She said, "What are you doing?" She was here in Terre Haute. I said, thinking she was going to come and say, "Let's do lunch." I said, "Not much." And she replied, "Good, drop what you're doing. We have to go to Italy, and we have to be there in 2 days." And off we went. Background was a friend of hers had a house and had to go to England and needed a house sitter. So along I went with her. That first 2 weeks, it was a whirlwind of museums and art, architecture, and Harriet just telling me all these incredible details. Wine, and Italian food. My first experience with real Italian food. Oh my God. So, Harriet said, "What's your favorite artist, Renaissance?" And I said, "Donatello," because I'm colorblind, so I really don't do paintings well. And she said, "Okay," and off we went to see every Donatello possible in Florence. And one day she talks to me, and she said, "In the 50s, I saw a Donatello crucifix in this little chapel out in the middle of yonder, and what was really unusual is it was a nude Christ. It didn't have the one cross. It was probably true to life, nude on the cross." And she said, "Let's go see if we can find it again." So she had use of the car, and I drove, totally illegally. I only had an Indiana license, but off we went, and we were going through the countryside, sunflowers and wheat, hills with castles and villas, medieval cities in the distance, bright blue sky, puffy clouds, cypress trees just poking their finger into the air, and Harriet going, "I think we should have turned back there." Or much, much more south. And we're just going. And we found that little chapel. And we pulled up. And there's a note on it saying, "Closed." But it would say the priest would be back at 1:30. It was 1, so we just sat there and waited. While we're sitting there, Harriet says, "The first time I came here, it was with a gay friend. And we got into the chapel, and there were 2 priests in there long black robes, they're Catholics. And she said, one of them spent the whole time chasing and flirting with me, and the other one spent the whole time chasing and flirting with my good friend, which I thought was a great, great visual. Anyway, the priest arrives, it's 1:30, gets out of the car, Harry goes, "Oh my God, it's the one who chased me." So, we go into the church, she's shattering to him in Italian. I don't speak Italian, I have no idea what they're saying. And I get in, I look around, and it's really obvious there's no new crucifix in this building, so I'm disappointed. Harry's still fine. She tells me later, what she's telling him is that I'm a very eminent Donatello expert, and that I have to have photographs of this piece. And happily I didn't speak Italian, because I'm sure the look on my face would, But she convinced him, and he said, well, it is here. Amazingly, just shortly after she had seen it back then, Rome took it to restore it. 30 years it was gone with the farmers that went to this church demanding it back, and it had just come back about 2 weeks before, and was hidden away in a storeroom, not to be shown until it could be rededicated. And she convinced this priest to open that storeroom door, turn on the lights, and let this eminent Donatello. Yeah, and so we go in there, and this crucifix hanging in the center of the room from a big beam, and it's almost 3/4 figure size, human size. I got to like that close. I could look at all, and it's fully restored. Even better, I'm one of the first persons to see this piece. I'm going, oh my God, how did this happen? And what's really weird is that was not unusual when I was with Harry. She was amazing at the things she could get done. So, oh my God. So, I have no idea where I've been. I'm still trying to keep within my 10 minutes. So, another really great memory is I was she was in Florence, which was her favorite city, as we all know, and I was in Venice, which is my favorite Italian city. And she called me and she said, we've never been to Rome. And I said, no. And she said, I think we should go. Last 2 days we're here. I said, okay. So I got there first to the train station. I knew which platform she was coming in on. So go to that platform and I'm waiting and she's not coming, And finally I see her in the distance and she is moving really slow, obviously in a lot of pain. This is just a couple of weeks before she had her knees replaced. And she, I went to meet her, and she's excited, exuberant, giving no evidence other than the hunched over pain, that there's any problem. And she said, what are we going to do first? And my first thought was, take you to the room so you can rest. But we know, Harriet, not an option. So I said what I do before she can sit. I said, I want to do something you literally told me you never wanted to do. And she got this confused look on her face, and she said, what on earth was that? I said, I want to go on one of those bus trips where you're taken all around the city of Rome, and some guy tells you all the details about what you're seeing. And she got a horrified look on her face. She said, you're right, I never wanted to do that. But if you want to, I will. So we go, we get our tickets. We're going to the bus, and I'd forgotten one little detail. There was no way she was going to sit in the bus. No, we had to go to the top of the bus. So here's her with her knees, and I'm helping her that curved-type little staircase. We get to the top, we get about in the center. We're sitting on the left side, and they've given us earbuds, and we plug them into our ports, and off we go. And the guy was talking about open sea, and she's going, that's not right. They're off by about 200 years. He forgot the most important detail. And I'm thinking, I have just created the worst experience, and she will never let me live it down. So just a few minutes later, she reaches over, grabs the wires of my earbuds, rips them out of my ear, and goes, you're not listening to this crap, I'm going to tell you. And so she did. So what was fun was, as I'm listening to, you know how Harriet was, when she gets into it, she's just details and talking and, and that's what she's doing, and I was loving it, I was learning, and I'm watching the people around us going, by the end of that trip, which was an hour long, everybody within earshot had taken their earbuds off and they were listening to Harriet's very much better presentation. She'd point, they'd look. She'd point, they'd look. Yeah, it was absolutely marvelous. And again, that was pretty much the way it always was when I was with Harriet. Just one last memory, and then I will not ever be done. I'm going to talk Harriet all the rest of my life, but for now. So, if anybody knew Harriet, she loved tree stump tombstones, okay? We went to cemeteries all over the Midwest looking at tree stump tombstones. One of the very first she took me to see was just south of here on Darwin Road, okay? And it's about 12 feet tall. It's a massive stone, and there's a carved eagle on top of it. And it was so expensive, the kids had carved how much it cost over their parents' grave, right into the tombstone. Yeah, it was a marvelous piece, and Sir Harriet took me there first. Well, just a couple of years ago, Mike Sid and I took her back, and we drove up to the cemetery, which is actually down a hill, the stone. We parked, we got out the wheelchair, put her into it, and we rolled her down the hill through this long grass bumpy, and she's going like this. We get down there, we spend about 5 minutes totally admiring this stone. Turn around, and then we have to push her back up that hill in her wheelchair. And she is so lucky that Mike and I didn't have a heart attack, because we would have just had to abandon her there. It was just really, really a wonderful time to be with her. Almost every person I know who, when they've gotten to know just a little bit of Harriet, invariably said, when I get to be her age, I want to be just like her. I do that, I still do that. I try to emulate the constant love of life, to always live in the moment, to always take a different road than what you've been on, and to look forward to what the day offers, the people to meet. Life is very short, but Harriet encompassed far more experience in hers than most people could do in 2 lifetimes. So I got to experience some of that with her. I don't know, again, how I lucked out so much, but I'm always going to try to emulate Harriet, my friend and teacher, what she taught me, and until the end of my life, be as much like her as possible, including these last few years. As her memories faded away, she still was the same. She still looked forward to the day. She still looked forward to seeing nature. She still looked forward to going on short rides. I want to be like that. I just absolutely want to be like that. And finally, I want to thank her family. Julie, Jim, Terence, thank you for being so willing to share your mother with me, because her life my life with her was beyond incredible. And in many ways, I've seen each of you with her qualities, and now she has grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and I know her genetics are going on, so I hope sometime in the future, the world will get to experience another form of a Harriet. That's my prayer to the universe. Thank you.
Yes, she just jumped up.
Yes.
Great-granddaughter? Great-grandniece, she just jumped up and down. And don't you all want to, even though it's very warm in here, I know you all want to jump up and down. And let me just say, Forense, I'm sure you'll agree with this. The hardest thing we ever did in this entire preparation was ask, as Harriet called him, Dave, to cut down his remarks. He left out my favorite story. Aha, okay, maybe you'll get to hear it after the program is over. Because I need to tell you something that is a little bit frightening. Harriet did not believe that any memorial service should be longer than 1 hour. It is now 1 hour. Whatever mystery remains, she's now frowning. I am confident that she will allow us to continue for just a few more minutes. David said, every person I know who knew Harriet almost invariably said, when I get to her age, I want to be just like her. Her physician, Kathy Steenstra, is unable to be here today, but she wrote a wonderful tribute, which will be a part of the taping that is being done after the conclusion of the program. And in it, she echoed David's sentiment with these words. After Harriet would leave the office, the staff would comment, "We want to be Harriet when we grow up." Yes, indeed. When our next speaker, Arthur Feinsod, and his wife, Mary Kramer, moved to Terre Haute, one of the first people they met was Harriet, who embraced them both personally and professionally. Harriet served on Mary's Art Spaces board from its inception and was a devoted supporter of Arthur's work as a theater director, playwright, and humanities scholar. Most importantly, from our point of view, she inspired him to write poetry. Arthur Feinsod.
Thank you, Sherry. I wrote a poem entitled She Is Gone just after I found out that Harriet's spirit had moved on. I had visited her 2 weeks before on my way from New Mexico to Terre Haute, and when I saw her, she was confused and disoriented. I was worried and knew the end was imminent. Then, 2 weeks later, I got the call that she had passed. I was in mourning when I wrote this poem and had not yet worked myself out of my own pain enough to express my feelings about Harriet's joy, happiness, and passion for living, and how she had often shared those traits with me and so many others, even in the last months of her life. But the poem is true to how I felt at the time I heard the news that she had passed. The title is She Is Gone, in memory of my dear friend, Harriet. She is gone. She whose smile lit every candle in the room. She who was our first friend in this little city she adored. She whose glowing friendship never wavered, never dimmed. She who brightened forever lights in the lives of so many students. She who was cursed with genes she knew would irrevocably darken her end. She who, the last time I saw her, had retreated even deeper into the blackness she feared. She whose spirit rode the back of a white dove after her daughter opened the window so that she, our Harriet, could let go, leave confusion behind and soar back into the light where she belongs, leaving me to figure out alone how to stay a light on the hill as I feel myself dim from her being gone. Harriet loved anything beautiful, whether it was music, art, poetry, a play, a person, a flower, whatever. And she would be visibly distressed over anything she felt was shoddy or poorly executed. Harriet admired beauty, and I like to think of her now as part of the beauty she loved. One of her favorite poets was Robinson Jeffers, and here's how Jeffers phrased that sentiment in this excerpt from his poem, Inscription for a Gravestone. I admired the beauty while I was human. Now I am part of the beauty. I wander in the air, being mostly gas and water, and flow in the ocean, touch you and Asia at the same moment. Have a hand in the sunrises and the glow of his grass. The last poem I'd like to read was the one I planned to read to Harriet in St. Louis 2 weeks before she died. I had written, I once was a bird, thinking of my own mortality, but found it strangely applicable to Harriet's and felt that she would appreciate it and that it might give her some peace. I never got to read it for various reasons, but I sent it to Firenze after she told me about her mom's passing, of how Firenze had opened Harriet's window towards the very end so her mom could better let go and set her spirit free. The title of the poem is I Once Was a Bird. I once was a bird. At times I can still feel what it was like to fly like one in the wild, soaring above borders. But that bird died, and I returned as a prisoner in this body, this shell, suffering claustrophobia from having too good a memory, and a profound inability to tolerate the tiny cell that holds my physical self. I now think of death not as another incarceration nor extermination, but rather as a consoling liberation, because this singing thing within will be free to fly again. I won't look back with longing once I've fled. I will catch my old friend the wind and soar higher, higher, and be gone.
Thank you, Arthur, for that compelling reminder of the simple fact that Harriet never lost the singing thing within her. She loved the natural world. She often sat in Fairbanks Park and watched the Wabash River drift by. Last week, a bench was placed across from the amphitheater that is inscribed with these words: Harriet McNeil. She loved life and this river in all of its seasons. The effort to have the bench installed was led by her daughter, Firenze, known by some as Florence, but not by Harriet, because Harriet named Firenze for the most beautiful city in the world, as she said, Florence, Italy. Firenze began her career as a botanist, perhaps because she, like her mother, loves to nourish plants and animals, and especially people. That love led her to study Buddhism. She's a Dharma teacher, essayist, editor, and a Unitarian Universalist minister. Firenze wrote her reflections and asked me if I would read them, because she felt that she could not get through them without tears. She has just reconfirmed that thought at this very moment. My dear Mom, I was born just 3 years before she moved to Terre Haute, and I grew up here and in Italy with her. Often just the two of us, wandering through cathedrals and piazzas together, me hoping we would stop for a gelato somewhere. Generations of her students learned their art history with slides that showed a little girl posed in front of Greek ruins or an Italian palazzo for perspective. She taught me to live life fully, generously, and adventurously. Although I never had her vast energy, editorial comment, who did? My friends and I secretly called her the force of nature. I am so grateful for what she taught me by the extraordinary way she lived and by her great capacity for love of not just me or other family members, but for a great circle of friends around the world and for life itself. 7 years ago, I moved back to the Midwest to be a support for her. Not that she seemed to really need it at 89. The first year, she was still driving over to Champaign-Urbana to visit me and to go to concerts at Cranach. Her final and greatest teachings to me came in those last 7 years, with the many challenges and, frankly, indignities that the far end of life, old age, brings to us. She met each of them with grace and dignity and never lost her joie de vivre or her kindness to others, not even in the last moments of her life. She never lost that incredible smile. Not that she didn't cry or wish her life was different, she did. But just the sight of anything beautiful would bring up the most intense joy. That joy. Her last words, and I believe these words were meant for the world and for life itself, were, I love you. I had the honor of witnessing the moment she went free, and I swear her spirit flew like an arrow into the blue sky she loved so much. A poem kept going through my mind. I had read it to her aloud on her last night, just as she and my father read poetry aloud to each other as she was in labor with me. Do not stand at my grave and weep. I am not there. I do not sleep. I am 1,000 winds that blow. I am the diamond glints on snow. I am the sunlight on ripened grain. I am the gentle autumn rain. When you awaken in the morning's hush, I am the swift, uplifting rush of quiet birds in circled flights. I am the soft stars that shine at night. Do not stand at my grave and cry. I am not there. I did not die. As each one of you knows, in spite of our stories and memories, we've barely made a ripple in the pool of Harriet's glories and her loves. Didn't you find, as you heard the speakers, didn't you find yourself thinking, and I remember the time when? But now, as we near the end of this celebration, we return, as we began, to Wordsworth. What, though the radiance that was once so bright be now forever taken from my sight, though nothing can bring back the hour of splendor in the grass, of glory in the flower, we will grieve not, rather find strength in what remains behind, in the soothing thoughts that spring out of human suffering, in the faith that sees through death, in years that bring the philosophic mind. As Dave mentioned, Harriet was Scottish. So for our final words, we turn to the great Scottish poet, Robert Burns. Few hearts like hers with virtue warmed. Few heads with knowledge so informed. If there's another world, she lives in bliss. If there are none, she made the best of this. I would now like to report to the heavens that we are 18 minutes over an hour. I would like to thank you all very much for coming. Please stay for refreshments. We're going to turn on the air conditioning, by the way. I know you had enough trouble hearing as it was, but thank you, Anthony, for all you did to make this happen. Don't forget to record some of your favorite memories, make corrections in stories that you heard. The lounge is just down the hall to the right. And please join me once again in thanking all of our speakers so much. Thank you.
Thank you again. I just wanted to say, we know there's no way we'll be able to record all of your stories because you have so many, and Harriet had so many friends. And so we're going to make it possible for you to either record a story with us here, or in groups with us here, or in some technologically mediated ways. After this will be, there's some sign-up sheets, there's some contact information. We have a photo album online that is open for you to add things to, or videos to. So somehow or other, we would love to gather all the stories that you might like to tell, and we know that time is too limited. So come and see me in the lounge outside if you have a chance and you want to, and otherwise see you online or in some other fashion.